Help, we're in trouble. It's all gone wrong. We should have cleaned our data before we implemented a new system and we didn't, and now it's a mess.
That is Susan Walsh, today's guest on the FarmSource podcast. Susan is known as the classification guru and does a lot of work improving procurement data in the pharma industry. She's also author of the book In Between the Spreadsheets, Classifying and Fixing Dirty Data, where she lays out her C.O.A.T framework, that's C.O.A.T, for creating better, more usable procurement data. But first, this episode is sponsored by Olon, empowering access to affordable healthcare. Olon is a leading international generic API supplier with a portfolio of over 300 APIs and more than 450 drug master files. They're a proven pioneer in generic API supply and market leadership, making a global impact. Find out more at olonspar.com. Now let's talk about dirty data, because that's probably a nightmare for most people. Most people want to actively avoid that sort of thing. So when did this become your passion?
Well, first of all, it's the kind of problem that everyone has, but nobody wants to admit. So it's not, I don't think before I started my business, it was really openly talked about properly. It became my passion because I accidentally fell into data about 11 years ago. Went to go and work for a spend analytics company and started classifying spend data. And I was like, oh, I really enjoyed this and I'm really good at it. And it doesn't feel like work. So that was great. And after 5 years there, building up a team, managing lots of projects, it was time to move on. And I hadn't come from procurement or the data space. So I was like, it's going to be hard to get a job doing this somewhere else. I don't even know what my job title is really. So let me start my own business. So I did that 6 years ago and kind of figured that 6 years ago, a lot of people were still outsourcing their dashboards and things like that you didn't really see in-house teams like you do today. But at the time, I thought there must be companies out there who just want their data cleaned or classified. And so I set up the business and started going to events and talking to people and finding out kind of what their problems were and what they needed and found that I was onto something. But nobody else was offering this service as a standalone thing. And so nobody was looking for me. So it's been a good few years building up a brand, a reputation and awareness, positioning myself as the go-to fixer of dirty data.
Why is it so important within procurement to have your spend data classified, normalised, and what can it do for you?
Well, it really is the foundation of everything that you do in procurement, whether that is reviewing contracts, negotiating with suppliers, looking for fraud, looking for trying to track and get information on suppliers. So for example, if you don't normalize your suppliers, you're going to end up with like 10 versions of PwC and a few versions of IBM. And I see Dell software, Dell marketing, it's all Dell. So as a procurement professional, you just need to know how much did I sell with Dell. You don't need to know the financial or legal entity, parent-child relationship. You just want to know how much did I sell. So normalizing in that way really helps with that. What that means is when you go to those companies, whether that be on a global or a regional level, you have more accurate data and potentially more bargaining and leverage to get better prices, better contracts with these suppliers, because you have the right information. If you don't do that, you could be missing out on really good opportunities. And you might think you've got a great deal, but your supplier on the other side is laughing because they've got the correct data and they know that you don't have the right data. And so they're taking advantage of you. And then there's things like searching for company information, especially at the moment, ESG, diversity. You want to make sure that the companies in your supply chain are ethical, responsible. And if you haven't normalized, you might miss out on a company that's actually a subsidiary of something else. I mean, it can be quite tricky. So it helps for you to find out the best information. But on the flip side of that, you have to be careful with the whole normalization thing, because there's companies like Microsoft that also own LinkedIn. And we would always normalize LinkedIn to LinkedIn, not Microsoft, because otherwise, inevitably, it ends up getting classified as software, which takes us on to the next part, which is getting correctly classified data. And that can tell you things like the number of suppliers you have per category, per country, per business unit. It can tell you how much you're spending with them. You know, if you've got 30 suppliers and you've spent $50 with them, do you need them on your systems? Should you just get rid of them? Or are they diverse suppliers? Do you need them there for a reason? The only way you'll know that is if you have the data. And then again, by having that classification and having it as detailed as possible, you can see what's being spent and where. Is it a legitimate spend? You know, is somebody buying a ton of wine from, say, Staples, but nobody's classified it? If it's not just gone under office supply, so nobody's really bothering. So every month there's like a few cases of wine getting ordered and nobody's really picked up on it.
Is this a real example?
No, but I'm sure it probably has happened. But you know, and then in those cases disappear because, you know, nobody's.
What kind of weird things do you see when you're working on projects like that? Any interesting examples?
Yeah, so an entertainment company who film and make videos and films and all that kind of stuff had some male escorts in their data set. Now,
really?
At first, when you're doing this, you're Googling for any other possible type of company with the same name, because you think, it can't be that. It surely can't. And then you start to find more companies that when you search them have the same services. And then you're like, okay, this is actually a thing that the entertainment companies are buying to obviously keep the actors entertained.
Okay.
And then the only dilemma is, do you put it under professional services or entertainment? And that was the you know, because the thing that I always say about classification of data is it has to be consistent. So it doesn't matter if we classified all the male escorts as entertainment. If we wanted to change them to professional services later on, it would be really easy because they're all in the one bucket. If you've got a mishmash, it's much harder to change. And that's where the data coat came in, which is making sure your data has its coat on. So like a jacket, you have to put it on. It's got to be consistent. So using the same terminology, the same units of measure. If you don't, you can end up with multiple versions of the same products in your data. Date formats, that's always a great one. You can have trouble matching up invoices, contract documents if the dates are all formatted differently. And I've seen, you know, you've got day, month, year, or month, day, year. You could spell out the month. You can then separate it with dashes, slashes, or dots, or might not even use a separator. So there are so many different ways that people in the same organization can format their dates, and that can cause all kinds of problems. As well as that, it could be like languages or currencies. Once it's consistent, it has to be organized. So categorize it, and also categorize it by region, country, business unit. Mm-hmm. Once you've got that, you've then got to aim for accurate data, and nobody's claiming that you'll ever have 100% accuracy in your data, but what you're trying to do is minimize the errors. So once you have your consistent, your organized, your accurate data, guess what? It's trustworthy. And that is your data coat. But unfortunately, you have to keep it on. So you can't just put it on and leave it. You have to maintain your data to make sure it stays on.
Very good. As you're talking, I'm struck by how much this is just as much an art as it is a science, and how it feels like there's so much to it, which is just down to individual interpretation.
Yeah, it's very subjective. There's often more than one right answer, which is why things like the data coat and the consistency is really important, because it can be down to someone's opinion. But context is also really important as well. An example I always give is DHL. Company like myself, I'm going to be using them as a courier, mailing services. A large manufacturer might be using them for warehousing, distribution.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to know the difference, because that's really going to affect their spend and how they look at their data if that's classified incorrectly. And that can happen with a range of different suppliers. They can be different classifications for different industries or different companies.
And so when you take on a project, is that typically there's some big internal initiative going on for, maybe it's an ERP system or an acquisition, or what is it that generally starts your engagement with a customer?
Help, we're in trouble. It's all gone wrong. We should have cleaned our data before we implemented a new system and we didn't, and now it's a mess. That's kind of what happens. Or we don't have any visibility on our spend data, or we've used a spend analytics company and our data's still not right. So it tends to be, rather than a proactive approach, it tends to be reactive, which I'm trying very hard to get people to start being more proactive with their data. But yes, there are, implementations, but sometimes they've tried it in a few other countries and it hasn't really worked. And so now they're like, okay, maybe you can help us now.
And then you'll go through a project, but then at the end of C.O.A.T, if you want to have it so it's working on an ongoing basis and they've brought those best practices in-house, how do you try to manage that so it's not just a one-off project and then it's all forgotten about? It's
hard, to be honest. People, quite often there's no budget for maintenance, or they think they can do it themselves. In a couple of instances, I've trained the staff and given them documents, handover notes. One client, we did a 6-month handover and we did every monthly refresh. We started them and then handed over and watched them do it. But you have to have that will and that mindset within the organization for it to work. You have to have the buy-in from the people involved. And they have to understand how important it is as well. They are saving themselves like months or weeks or days in a year's time when the data needs to be reviewed. If you're slowly maintaining it, like cleaning a house, if you clean it every week, it's going to be easier to clean on an ongoing basis. If you leave it for a month or two, then it's just, for me, that would just be, I'm allergic to dust. So that's my worst nightmare. I'd be sneezing all over the place. And, it's harder to clean. And it's just the same with data.
What best practices could you share if someone opened up the bonnet and they were just starting to look at the state of their data and how to get it into a more usable, more analyzable state? What should those steps be?
Get it in Excel. It doesn't even need to be all of it. If it's a large amount of data, choose a country, a division, a region, even a category, and then get a pivot table and put your suppliers by value, and if it's categorization, then put that into, and you will know who your biggest suppliers are. So the first thing to do is check them. Are they classified correctly? Because if not, you've got a problem throughout your whole data. If your biggest, most important suppliers are incorrectly classified, then you have a problem. Secondly, start looking for suppliers with words in their name or description that are obvious. So things like hotels, taxis, restaurants. Again, if those really obvious things are wrong, then you've got a wider problem with your data. And please, please, please do not focus on the top 80% of spend, because all the problems that you're most likely to find will be in what is known as the tail spend, which is traditionally the bottom 20% or below $1 million or something like 100K, depending on the client, because that's where you're going to find most of your rogue and maverick spend, potentially some fraud. It's going to be the little suppliers that are going to catch you out.
What type of fraud have you come across?
I don't really know if it's fraud. That's up to the client. I haven't heard. It's probably not something they would want to necessarily share, but I've heard of people siphoning things off and maybe putting in double orders of things, maybe even getting the PO paid twice by replacing the 0 with an O. And it can also happen if you have, for example, in your supplier database, 2 or 3 versions of the same account, named slightly differently, maybe the address is a little bit different. People don't know which PO to assign it to, so it ends up going to maybe 2 of them, and then it gets paid twice and nobody realizes. There are a lot of things that can go on, unfortunately. And it's, again, using context, knowing your business, looking for things that stick out, and really, to do that, you have to be regularly looking at your data, because the more you look at it, the easier and faster it is to spot when something sticks out and doesn't look right. We see this with classification all the time. We get a client's file, and within a day we can tell when something doesn't look right.
When does it become too complicated? When it comes to categorization, would you recommend going down several levels in a taxonomy? When does a project become over-engineered? And is there a recommended level of detail to go into?
Yeah, it really depends on the level of detail you have in your invoice description for a start, and if the business needs that level of detail. So that's the first thing. The other thing is you have to have a good taxonomy. So we're doing a project right now. I built out a taxonomy. It went back to the business for corrections. We're now classifying the data. We're finding it very difficult because they removed a lot of the stuff that I knew we would need in the taxonomy. So now we don't have a generic computer option. We have to define whether it's a laptop or a desktop. And then you have to Google that. And so that adds more time onto the project. And so it's looking at whether you need it and what's acceptable for the purposes of reporting and all those kinds of things.
It's one of those things which sounds really simple, but I've been in so many meetings and in committees where you're trying to agree a taxonomy, and everyone's got their own view on what reports into where.
Oh my goodness. My first project where we were building out a new taxonomy, I let everybody get involved, and we had about 50 different versions of the taxonomy, and we ended up near, so they all wanted lots of detail, so we started classifying with the detail, and then they decided they didn't want it, so that was a lot of wasted hours of work, and we kind of ended up where we were at the start by the end. So I learned in that to have as minimal involvement as possible with just your key stakeholders, and then you say, this is the taxonomy and this is what we are doing, this is what we're using. And that's kind of happened in the project we're working on now. I think they've let other departments change it, and then that's not really working for the rest of the classification process. So
is there any final advice you'd like to share for people in procurement and how they can get better at handling data?
So I think, again, it's look at it regularly. Even if it's just like 5 minutes a day, just start to get familiar with it. If you can, normalise and classify it. And it doesn't have to be every week or month. It could be quarterly or 6 monthly. Get on top of that. And when you do, and you generally have a team working on this, get that data coat on. So make sure it's consistent, organised, accurate and trustworthy. And that will help minimise the errors and hopefully make your lives a little bit easier.
Great, thank you. And I guess if anyone's got any questions, they can always head to theclassificationguru.com.
Yes, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Susan Walsh, the classification guru. There's only one of me, so pretty easy to find. And,
with about 33,000 followers, I noticed.
Just a few, yeah.
Yeah, just a few friends.
Yeah.
All right, Susan, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much.
And a big thank you to Olon for sponsoring this episode. Olon are empowering access to affordable healthcare. They're a proven pioneer in generic API supply and market leadership. Find out more at olonspa.com. Thank you for listening.